I could watch that movie over and over. My name is Bob Nielsen. I'm the Extension Corn Specialist at Purdue University. Actually, I am a partially retired Extension Corn Specialist at Purdue University because I began a part-time retirement program back in January of 2020, a couple of months before COVID shut us down, and I've been working from home ever since. But as I look towards stepping down completely in another year or two, I've decided I need to start sorting through books and knickknacks in my office and begin to clean it out in anticipation of my successor who's due to arrive in May of 2021. And as I was looking through stuff in the office, I came across this coffee mug. It was given to me by one of my favorite county extension agents who has since retired. But nevertheless, he gave it to me with a photo that he took some years ago. And I'm struck by several things. One is I had a lot more hair back in the day, and my beard was a lot darker than it is today. The photo still has a glare on top of the head, but the glare is on hair and not bare skin. But finding this mug made me think a little bit back on the research I was doing in those early years. And I was doing a lot of small plot research at the agronomy farm and a few other places. But I also did on-farm research. And I felt pretty proud about that. One of my first forays into it was down in southwest Indiana. And I was pleased with it. I was collaborating with a colleague I'd met from a seed company, and we were doing all this great stuff on farm. But as I look back, I realized that maybe what I was calling on-farm research was not really on-farm research. So let me show you an example of what that may have looked like. So this is actually a Google Earth photo, but it shows an area in the field of that I'm highlighting there of some small plots inside of a larger field. And in fact, that was the kind of so-called on-farm research I was doing back in the 1980s. Now that photo is not of my plots, but it certainly could have been, because that's what I was doing. I was asking farmers for a small area of a larger field. I would come down with my own equipment to plant the plots. I would take care of it during the summer, take my notes, collect my data, and at the end of the year would typically harvest it by hand, because at that point in time I did not have a small plot combine. And this is what I called on-farm research. I felt pretty good about it because I was out in the state, I was with farmers, and that made me feel good. But I realize now that it really wasn't what I call on-farm research today. It was simply me putting small plots out into a larger field, and frankly, there was never very much collaboration or involvement by the farmer. The farmer would prepare the land in the spring. I would come down with my equipment to plant the plots. I would come down off and on during the summer to collect data. Often didn't even see the farmer when I came down. And so there just wasn't much involvement with the grower. And frankly, it was probably more of a nuisance for the grower than anything else. Now, he was kind enough to never say that to me. Maybe it's because I was a young extension person at the time, but I think it really was a nuisance, and I think I caused him all sorts of headaches simply by being inside of one of his larger fields. Well, my on-farm research today looks much different. It looks more like this photo in the background on this slide. My trials range from, say, 30 to 80 acres in size. Individual plots within these trials range from 30 feet wide to 60 feet wide, so 12 rows of corn to 24 rows of corn will capture most of the trials that I do now. And they run the entire length of the field, as you see in this photo. Because the fields are large, we can use commercial farming equipment to put out the trials, to take care of the trials, and to harvest the trials at the end of the year. And we use precision ag technology where it fits. And so sometimes we're using variable rate controllers. We are always using yield monitors at the end of the year. And then we use mapping software to design these trials ahead of time and make sure it fits inside of the field. And then when we collect our data, especially the yield data, we're using GIS software to analyze the data, to do some of the spatial analysis that we can do with these large yield data sets. So this is more what my on-farm research looks like today. Now, there's benefits to growers from collaborating with us on this kind of research. Among other things, they get first look at the results from the trials that we're doing in their fields. At the end of the year, I put together a 1 or 2 page summary of those results and send it out to the grower, and they get first look at it. We hope that what we learn in these trials will help them improve yield and profit in their farming operation, and that's one of the driving forces of farmers to collaborate with us, is to gain this kind of knowledge. Farmers that work with us for several years also tell us there's a few other benefits. One that they seem to value is simply spending time with us during the year. Prior to COVID, we would ride shotgun in the tractor at planting time. If it's a side dress trial, we would usually ride in the tractor or in the high clearance machine like you see in the background here. And at harvest time, we always try to ride shotgun and just collect sort of the casual harvest notes as we go through the field. And so while we are riding along with these farmers, and then when we go down to take notes, sometimes we're walking in the fields with the farmers. Obviously we're focusing on the research itself, but there's a lot of time available to simply visit back and forth. And so farmers have the opportunity to ask me questions about things beyond just what we're doing in the field. I get to ask them questions about their farming operation and the different technologies that they're using. And so there's this value that can be attributed to simply spending time together in this kind of collaboration. And then the final benefit I think farmers can gain from collaboration like this is that they learn how to do research well. And I don't say that in a demeaning way, but if you're not skilled in conducting research, sometimes you don't really understand what it takes to develop a statistically sound trial and to work with the data. And so when farmers collaborate with us over the course of a couple years, they certainly gain experience in the simple things like, why do we replicate? Why do we randomize treatments in the field? Why are we so nitpicky about the details of the trial and making sure that we do everything right? And so farmers tell us that this is beneficial to them because when we're no longer there and they decide they want to do some other set of trials, they have the skill set now to conduct their own on-farm research without necessarily having us there to help. Now, us as researchers, we also benefit from collaborating with growers. And among other things, when we can combine a series of on-farm trial results with the results that we get from the similar kind of field-scale trials at the Purdue farms, this allows us to build a large database more quickly. And by building it more quickly, it allows us to eventually develop guidelines more quickly and get this information out to our clientele. And the other benefit of combining on-farm trials with Purdue farms is that we can get into a broader section of the state and we can evaluate these treatments over a wider range of growing conditions than we maybe could simply sticking on the Purdue farm. So we can evaluate treatments over maybe a broader set of soil types, a broader set of weather conditions, different levels of pest pressure. And because of this evaluation over a wider range of growing conditions, the guidelines and recommendations that we eventually develop from the results of these trials tend to be more reliable. They'll tend to be practices that will work most of the time, no matter what the growing conditions are. And then maybe sort of a final benefit is that because these results and the guidelines are coming from field-scale trials, it simply adds credibility to these guidelines for the growers when we're promoting them around the state. The researchers and the farmers bring different things to the table when we're doing on-farm research. The farmer actually brings quite a bit to the table. The farmer brings the land, their equipment, usually some precision ag technology, So those physical kinds of contributions to the trial. We hope they bring interest to the table, because if they're not interested in the trial, they're probably not going to pay as much attention to the details as they otherwise would. They need a little bit of patience, because sometimes we researchers are not the easiest kind of people to get along with. We tend to be nitpicky, we tend to be pretty demanding, and so farmers need to be patient with us and put up with some of our shenanigans. And then finally, we hope farmers have the ability to pay attention to detail. And it actually turns out that farmers who work with us, who do a really good job, I think deep down maybe they have a real interest in research itself, and they really do pay a lot of attention to details. Now, the researchers, what we bring to the table are, I guess you'd say, more of the soft skill sets. So we bring our experience and skills in conducting research. We bring experience in scouting fields, because basically when we're collecting data, it sort of is a kind of glorified field scouting. And we are skilled at collecting data itself, and we have the time and the labor to do that. And then we also have the experience on working with the data at the end of the trial and doing all of the analysis, and increasingly more of the analysis that's done using spatial software, because we're dealing with such large data sets in the fields. And when everybody brings all of these things to the table, it increases the success, the potential for success of on-farm research dramatically. Now, I would be remiss if I did not mention the scientific method. Yes, the scientific method. This is part of the nitpickiness that I referred to earlier of us researchers, that we tend to be pretty picky on following certain ways of conducting research. And let me just show you a little bit of what the scientific method is all about. And we can think of it as a sort of a workflow or a diagram. So it begins with asking the question, and you might say, well, that's not very difficult. Well, in reality, sometimes getting that question correct is a really challenging part of beginning a research trial. What is the actual question we're trying to answer? And once we have that question, well, then there's sort of a related thing that comes into play, and that is, what's our hypothesis, all right? So if the question is, does corn need sulfur fertilization, then the hypothesis is, it's related, and it may be something as simple as, we don't think corn needs sulfur fertilization, and that's our hypothesis. But the fact that we've identified what the question is then allows us to identify what are the relevant treatments. And so when we're asking the question about sulfur fertilization, obviously we need a treatment that does not have sulfur. And then we need one or more treatments that do have sulfur. Well, then the question is, what rate do you use? And because we don't know what the right rate is, we put in a number of different rates, because we hope to find the rate that's optimum. So again, asking the right question eventually drives or leads to identifying what the relevant treatments are. Once those have been identified, then we can go about the business of planning the research. And of course, a lot of the planning, or almost all the planning, is done before we even hit the field. And once those plans are in place, then we can implement the trial. And it may be treatments that go out at planting. It may be treatments that go out with side dress fertilizer applications. It might be some spray applications, depending on the kind of trial that we're doing. And then once we have the treatments in place, then the rest of the summer, along with traditional field scouting, we're collecting data that's meaningful to the question, and taking a lot of field notes in the field. That's sort of redundant, isn't it? Field notes in the field. And then, of course, we have to analyze all that data that we're collecting, and that can sometimes be a chore depending on the volume of data that's collected. And then once we analyze the data, we try to interpret the results. And at this point, you might say, well, the research is done. No, it isn't. Once we interpret the results, basically we go full circle and we begin planning for the next year's research, because it's very important to repeat field research to look for consistency of performance. And so we may repeat this research over different locations. We may repeat the research over years. But we go through some number of cycles of repeating the research over and over. And eventually, once we have enough data, once we think we have enough reliable data, eventually then we're maybe done with that particular research, but good research always leads to more questions. And so the whole scientific method process begins all over. This doesn't look very complicated, but it does represent an orderly way to approach research and avoids us sort of going out willy-nilly and pulling treatments out of thin air and not really having a plan for it. When we first work with growers or ask growers to collaborate with us, there's always this initial discussion over the coffee table, over the kitchen table as to, okay, what's involved with this, especially when it's a farmer that we've not worked with in the past and who may not know what to expect. And so obviously we start with, here's the objectives of the proposed research. It might be a nitrogen trial, it might be a plant population trial, it might be a foliar fungicide trial, but here are the objectives of the proposed research. And right off the bat then we're sort of asking the grower, okay, are you interested in this or not? And of course, if they have no interest whatsoever, we shake hands, walk out the door, and we go on to the next grower. But if they're interested in what we're doing, well, then we start getting into a bit more of the details. Okay, what fields do you have that might be appropriate, both in terms of size, but also maybe in terms of the soil map layout or other considerations about fields. What kind of field equipment do you have? What planter, what sidedress applicator, what sprayer, and what kind of precision ag technologies do you have? Because sometimes, many times, those technologies can really facilitate conducting the research and reduce the logistical headaches for the growers. And then once we get through some of those discussions, then we start talking about, okay, well, here's the experimental treatments that we're probably going to do. Here's how the trial is going to look like. Here's the design of the trial. Here's how it's going to fit in your field. And are you still interested with this, or what can you tell us about what we're proposing that maybe is stupid and we need to rethink because we're not as practical. We don't have the experience that you do. And so there's a lot of this give and take in the negotiations. And then one of the final things we visit about with the grower is, are there going to be any possible additional expenses for collaborating for the farmer, for collaborating with us in this field, or are some of the treatments we're proposing going to cause yield losses for you? And we've never been fortunate enough, at least in our program at Purdue, to have enough funding to be able to compensate growers for these kinds of losses in terms of additional expenses and yield losses. And so the farmers need to understand, or we need to be upfront with them, that if there's going to be additional expenses, if there's going to be yield losses, here they are, here's our estimates, and are you okay with this? And you might say, well, my gosh, why would I agree to lose money by working with you on this on-farm research? Well, the grander idea is, or maybe the more important question is, what are you going to learn by collaborating with us that may improve yield over the rest of your farming operation and improve your bottom line over the rest of your farming operation? So these are the things that we discuss with the grower ahead of time. And once we're done with that discussion, if the grower says, hey, no way on earth am I willing to do this, fine. We shake hands, leave as friends, no hurt feelings. But if they decide, you bet, I'm on board with it, well, then we move ahead with the project and just move right along. So I mentioned this precision ag technology and the beauty of it. The simple beauty of the precision ag technology is that it simplifies or minimizes the logistics for the collaborating farmer. And frankly, if there's a lot of logistics involved, they become headaches for the grower. And this is why we weren't able to do this kind of field scale research 30 years ago, because we did not have some of these pieces of the precision ag technology that simplify life for the participating grower. And then secondly, because of minimizing the headaches for the grower, and they're more willing to work with us, The same technologies allow us to simply conduct these trials, these large field scale trials, and make them statistically sound in the way we design them and the way they get implemented. And again, prior to the availability of much of these technologies, I simply wasn't able to design a trial on a large field like you see behind us here in the slide. And now we're able to do very statistically sound research in these large scale fields. Among the precision ag technologies, yield monitors were probably they were the first, frankly, that opened the door to simplify the logistics of conducting it. And so in the old days, we would weigh each plot with a weigh wagon. Prior to yield monitors, we would weigh each plot with a weigh wagon. And of course, that was a pain right there. Today, once we have that yield monitor calibrated, the farmer can simply harvest the field like they normally do and basically harvest nonstop. So we've almost eliminated the logistics for the grower at harvest time and to make it as painless as it can be. But these same yield monitors then allow us as researchers to use these bigger fields and the larger individual plots. And the beauty of that is that it allows us then to explore these what I call geospatial questions of okay, if we're doing a plant population trial, does this part of the field require a different optimum population than this part of the field? Or if it's a nitrogen rate trial, does this soil type require a higher nitrogen rate than that soil type? And with these large fields, with a lot of this natural field variability, we can use our software and the yield data coming from monitors to help answer these site-specific kinds of questions. Variable rate controllers are another piece of the puzzle that really simplified logistics. Now, this pretty colored map that you see here is an example of a nitrogen rate trial. Each of those long rectangular colored strips represent 12 rows by length of the field, and there are 6 different colors that correlate to 6 side dress nitrogen rate treatments. And if you count any of the colors, you'll find there are 5 of them going across the field. And so they're replicated 5 times. You can tell the sequence is sort of jumbled. The technical term is randomization. This is a 30 or 40 acre field. Odd-shaped fields, you can see the length of the plots are different going across. I mean, this odd-shaped field itself would have been a nightmare back in the day prior to having this technology. But we design these trials ahead of time with the mapping software, and I'll show an example of that later on in the presentation. But the point I want to make with this slide is that once I've created this plot map with all of the randomized side dress nitrogen rates laid out in the positions they're actually going to be in the field, then with my software, I can convert those into prescription files that we can then give to the farmer on a thumb drive. They upload it to the display in the tractor cab or the high clearance applicator and just start side dressing the field. And the variable rate controller with the prescription file as part of it will take care of changing the rates on the go. So we've essentially eliminated the logistics for the grower on the day of side dressing by simply allowing the variable rate controllers to change those rates as he side dresses across that field from one side to the other. And it's a great benefit for those kind of trials to be able to create these prescriptions ahead of time and then simply side dress and not worry about changing the rates on the go. Now, if sometimes a grower doesn't have a variable rate controller, or sometimes the treatments we're looking at are simply not compatible with prescription files. So for example, if we're doing a foliar fungicide trial and maybe we've got, well, obviously we'll have a 0 fungicide treatment, and let's say we're looking at 2 different foliar fungicides, and so the second treatment would be fungicide number 1, and the third treatment would be fungicide number 2, and so they're really not compatible with prescriptions. Well, we can still use technology to simplify the application logistics of the grower. We can't eliminate the headaches, but we can certainly simplify them by using Autosteer. And so Autosteer enables us to put out all of the randomized replicates of a treatment before we change the equipment settings, or perhaps before we change the mixtures of the treatment that's being applied. So let me show you an example of that in the next slide. So this is that same field we were looking at, and the animation is showing the application of one of those nitrogen rates going across the field, all 5 replicates of that rate. And so with Autosteer technology, the display, the controller display in the cab, numbers the different passes through the field. And usually they're called swath numbers. And so ahead of time, we know where swath number 1 is and swath number 33. We know where they are in the field. And so we can create a plot list with our different treatments lined up with the different swath numbers in the field. And so in the case of this example, the nitrogen rate that was being put out, we know that the 5 reps of that rate correspond to swaths number 4, 10, 21, 26, and 33. And so as we're going through the field, we line up on swath number 4, and line up meaning in the display, and we do swath number 4, and then we simply navigate to swath number 10 when we get to the other end of the field, do that application. On the east side of the field, we again navigate to swath number 21, and we just keep doing that through the course of a field. And when we get to the end of that 5th rep of the treatment, then we get out and we either change the applicator setting, or maybe we're changing the treatment in the tank. The point is, we can put out all the reps of individual treatments using Autosteer. There's still logistics involved because you're sort of dinking around, going through the field, navigating from one to the other. But it can be done. It's just not the ideal, especially if it could be done with variable rate control. Now, sort of a side benefit to the technology, especially when you're using variable rate treatments, is that most of these controllers will log what actually gets put down. We call them as-applied data logs. And so here's an example from this same field. This is the as-applied nitrogen rates that were logged by the controller as it was going across the field putting out the nitrogen. And the beauty of this kind of as-applied data is that it allows us to document whether or not we actually put down the rates that we wanted to put down for the sake of the experiment. Sometimes we find there were mistakes made, and without this kind of data, we may never have known that there was a mistake made in the treatment. So from a research perspective, it's extremely valuable information. But I'd also dare say from a farmer perspective, on a non-research kind of basis, that there is also advantage to having access to this kind of data to simply verify that your equipment is working correctly, and it can help you spot problems that you can correct and improve for the next time. So I talked about how these large field scale trials sometimes allow us to look at site-specific type questions. So this is an example of one of our plant population trials. It's one of the larger trials that we've done. It was a 150-acre trial down in southeast Indiana. There were, I believe, 6 seeding rates in this trial. And let me see if I can highlight behind the scenes. So down here in that lower left corner, and then if you maybe look along, just peeking out on the right side, you can see those similar kind of rectangular colored strips going through the field. Those represent the seeding rate prescriptions that we created and that the farmer used to plant the trial. Now, what is laying on top of that plot design or that plot layer, technically it's yield data, but it's yield data that's being displayed on the basis of the soil map units underneath it. And the beauty of this yield data, or any spatial data, is that we can literally intersect these layers. And so I can take the yield data and I can merge it with the soil map data and tag every one of those yield data points with the soil map unit. And once I've done that, then I can display the yield data like we see here, and actually show you where the different soil types were in the field. And so every one of these soil types, and if you can barely see my black highlighter going around this bright pink polygon in the field, that is one of the soil types in the field. The dark purple is another soil type, etc., etc. And so once I intersect the yield data with the underlying soil map, then I can extract all of the data from the pink soils and look at the yield response to population just for that soil type. I can extract all of the yield data from the dark purple soils in this map and look at the yield response to population just for that soil type. And this is the way, frankly, it's the best way to determine whether there are any site-specific yield responses to the treatments that we're looking at. And it's one of the biggest benefits to us as researchers of doing this field scale research is the ability to do this kind of merging with underlying characteristics and try to answer these site-specific questions. So, talk a little bit about the analysis of data and the interpretation of data, because it's not always straightforward. And that's because sometimes differences that we see in yield between treatments in a field or treatment plots in the field, sometimes those differences are in fact due to treatments, but sometimes they're simply due to natural variability that exists in the field. It may be variability for drainage, it may be variability for pests, fertility gradients in the field. So sometimes the differences we measure between treatments in the field is simply due to where those treatments themselves were in the field. And because of this field variability and the impact it has on not only the analysis of the data, but the interpretation of the data, that's why replication and statistical analysis is so important for what we do in this kind of research. So we replicate treatments, meaning we put out more than one of them in a field. We replicate treatments within a trial simply to allow us to mathematically separate the true treatment effects from those that are due to other kinds of natural variability that exists in the field. And at the very least, even if we're not performing the statistical analysis, at the very least, replicating treatments in a field help us determine whether those so-called treatment effects were consistent across the field. So if this treatment yielded better than that treatment every time in the field, even without any statistical analysis, you can probably say that one treatment was better than the other. But if in one rep treatment A yields better than treatment B, the next rep treatment B yields better than treatment A, and maybe the third rep treatment A yields better than treatment B, and the fourth rep treatment B yields, you see what I'm doing? It's going back and forth, it's not consistent. And so this is what replication does for us in these field trials. So sort of to tie in with that, I'll say that the simple goal for any field research project is to identify treatments or, let's say, crop management practices that work most of the time, practices that are profitable most of the time, meaning they'll work across a wide range of growing conditions. That's the goal for doing field research, is what can we identify that will work pretty good most of the time. We know intuitively, right, that what works in one field may not work in another. They have different soil types, they have different fertility levels, they have different management by the growers. And so we know intuitively that what we learn in one field may not apply to another field, so we really need to also look at how it performs in the other field. So that's intuitive. I think we all agree with that. What may not be as intuitive is that even for one field, what we learn in 1 year may not be the same thing that happens in another year, simply because of the differences in growing conditions, even in one field 1 year to another. This is an example of a field. It's a 30-acre field, and these are yield maps in 4 different years. And they're scaled all the same. So the dark green is above 200 bushels in every map. The dark red is anything below 50 bushels in every map. So they're scaled the same. And we know that yields are not the same year in and year out in a given field. And that's because growing conditions vary one year to another. And that's why even in a given field, we need to repeat research to see how do these treatments perform under different growing conditions. And so the key to conducting successful field research is this objective of evaluating crop responses to treatments in as broad a range of growing conditions as we can. Usually that's some combination of a multiple number of locations and multiple years. But it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of time, locations, and years to do this. And this is why in our field scale research program, we tend to focus on a small number of projects, but we try to get as many locations and years on each of those projects as we can. And so the value of on-farm research, somewhat similarly, is not what we learn from a single trial, but rather what we learn when we combine the results of many trials together. Because more than anything else, when we do that, we are combining a wide range of growing conditions. We're looking for that repeatability. We're looking for that consistency in treatments or in crop management practices. So these are the kinds of trials that me and Jim Camerato have done since 2006 around the state. It's been a combination of on-farm trials and Purdue farm trials. We're fortunate that most of the Purdue research farms have large fields that we can conduct this kind of research in. So the red circles indicate the various Purdue research farms scattered around the state, and you're probably familiar with one or more of them. The yellow counties represent counties where we've had one or more on-farm trials. And so when you look at this list, there's obviously, it's pretty clear we've had quite a few nitrogen trials, quite a few plant population trials. Those were the first subjects or first topics that we began looking at in 2006. In recent years, we've begun to focus more on starter fertilizer responses, biological treatments of various kinds, sulfur fertilization. And so we have quite a few trials on a small number of topics. And again, the combination of on-farm trials with Purdue farms allows us to increase the database pretty quickly, but it also broadens how much we can sample the geographic extent around the state and how much we can sample a wide range of growing conditions. So a little bit on the size of trials and the size of plots. The required acreage of a field to conduct this trial depends on how many plots and how big those plots are going to be inside the field. And typically our field scale trials range from 15 to say 35 individual plots in the field. The trials themselves, as I've indicated before, range from about 30 acres to 80. You saw the one example of a 150 acre trial, and we've actually had one trial as large as 400 acres. It was a beautiful row spacing by plant population trial that I've never been able to replicate because of how large it was. The trial length is typically length of field. We personally avoid putting small trials inside of larger fields. We have found that going the length of the field actually is better statistically, and so our trials typically range from, say, 1,300 feet to 2,600 feet long. The size of the individual plots, needs to be compatible with all the field equipment that's used in the trial, because we certainly don't want pieces of equipment sort of overlapping into other treatments. And so we talk to the grower about what size of planter, what size of combine header. Those are the two key things. If it's a nitrogen trial, we're interested in the width of the nitrogen applicator. If it's a foliar fungicide trial, what's the width of the sprayer? The key thing is we try to come up with a plot width that is compatible with the other equipment being used in the trial. Typically, it ends up being twice the width of the combine header. And this is important to us because, as you see in this video running in the background, and this is a video of a trial that has 12-row plots. Let me see if I can back up. You can see, sort of get a sense that it's harvesting down the middle and taking out 6 rows, leaving 6 rows in between. And excuse me for having to go back and forth with this. But anyway, we harvest the middles for the trial data, and then the in-betweens, which are a full combine header width, they're taken out basically as bulk yield. Now at the Purdue farms, we tend to take out the middles first, come back and glean the in-betweens. In a farm situation, the farmer can just simply harvest all the way across the field, and then we will extract the plot middles later in the yield data using our software. Okay, so a little bit on trial design, which might be more information than you want, but I still want to cover it. Trials are often designed as what we call randomized complete blocks. And this is an example of a simple trial with 3 blocks, or replicates if you will, and 3 treatments. And so let me draw a line, highlight around this first rep. All right, so there's rep number 1, there's rep number 2, there's rep number 3. We've got border rows on each side of it. And then inside of the trial are the 3 treatments, 1, 2, and 3. So we're grouping the treatments inside of reps and then multiple reps throughout the field. So a randomized complete block. Every rep contains all 3 treatments. All right? And the sequence of the treatments within each rep is randomized. All right, and so in rep number 1, the sequence is this. Let me highlight for you. The sequence is 2, 1, 3. In rep number 2, it's 2, 3, 1. And in rep 3, it's 3, 2, 1. All right, so the treatment sequence differs one replicate to another. And you might say, why on earth do you want to do that? Because that creates a lot of logistical headaches for me. Well, we do it for the statistical reason that it reduces the chances that some field variability that we have no idea about will unfairly influence one treatment or some treatments over others. And that's one of the reasons why we do it. So an example where this is a field where maybe there's a fertility gradient from high fertility on the north to low fertility on the south. And if the treatments were always, in every rep, always 1, 2, 3 in every rep, well, in this example, because the fertility is slowly getting worse and worse and worse and worse as you go from north to south, treatment number 1 might always yield better than the other treatments. May have nothing to do with the treatments, but it's yielding better than the other treatments because in every rep, the fertility is slightly better in that treatment, all right? And we don't always know where this variability is in the field, and so we randomize simply to reduce the odds of any of this going on that would unfairly influence one treatment over another. So obviously at some point during this process, the trial has to be laid out. It has to be designed ahead of time. When we're working with yield data, that data usually has to be processed and cleaned and summarized. And then at some point, we're going to work with those summarized data and run some statistical analysis. And these are often stumbling blocks for growers and the people who may work with them, because growers and consultants often don't have good access to the appropriate software. And because of that, they often don't have the experience of working with GIS programs or statistical programs. And so these kinds of skill sets and software packages are what we researchers bring to the table in these collaborative on-farm research projects. This is the stuff that we do as part of our contribution to the trial. So let me show you in a little example of the workflow that I use on designing a trial. So here's that same field that we've looked at before in this presentation. And so I happen to use Trimble Ag software, which used to be called FarmWorks before Trimble purchased them. And I'm not necessarily promoting the software, I'm just telling you this is what I use. So I'll load the georeferenced field boundary into that software, and you can barely make out the red field boundary, and let me highlight it for you a little bit with the marker, or at least I'll highlight part of it for you, right? So I load in this field boundary into the software, and then there's a tool in this Trimble Ag software called a buffer tool. It's not meant to create plot plans, but I use it to sort of cheat and do an end around. And so I'll create a plot layer that fits that field boundary and positions those plots where I want it to be. And so the first iteration of that might look like this, where I put in the end rows around the edges of the field, and then in this case, I've put in 12 row or 30-foot wide individual plots going across the field. These are lined up with the guidance line, assuming there's Autosteer technology being used. And so every plot is exactly where it's going to be in the field. And then I begin assigning the rep identifications and the randomized plot treatments to the field. And so the next iteration that I'm showing you here are simply the 1, 2, 3, 4 reps in the field. Let me try and draw. So there's rep number 1, there's rep number 2, there's rep number 3 if you can make it out, and up here is rep number 4. All right, and I've assigned those to each of the plots, and then I'll also add in what exact treatments there are. Now remember this example before where once I've got the treatment numbers assigned to the plots, then the final step where it's appropriate is I can generate these prescription files, export them to a thumb drive, and that's what we're going to give to the farmer to upload to their controller to do something, say, like a side dress trial. During the season, we try to collect appropriate data and as much as we can, and so I've already mentioned the Asapplied data that we can get from the planters and the fertilizer applicators, etc. We do some manual crop measurements in the field. Sometimes there's simple things like plant height and population and things like that. If it's appropriate, we collect plant samples or soil samples for nutrient analyses or maybe plant biomass measurements. Increasingly, we're using drone imagery to collect crop reflectance data. Now, I'll talk a little bit later about using drones for scouting, but we can actually use the crop reflectance data. We can extract it from the images and use it as actual data to look at crop responses to treatments. And we're doing this more and more and more now over the last few years. And then, of course, at the end of the season, we're harvesting the field and estimating grain yield and moisture. So in terms of crop scouting, it is important to scout these fields regularly when we're conducting this on-farm research. We scout them in a traditional sense to identify problems that maybe can be addressed soon. So if I'm in say a side dress nitrogen trial, but I'm finding some gray leaf spots starting to explode, then I'll share that information with the grower and encourage them to consider some foliar fungicide, not necessarily for the sake of the research trial itself, but for the overall profitability of the field for the farmer's sake. So we do a lot of this traditional crop scouting just to look for problems like that. But also from a research perspective, we walk these fields or fly these fields to identify problem areas that maybe have a chance of unfairly influencing one treatment over another. And again, drone imagery is particularly useful for that. And so let me see. I didn't do what I wanted to. Let me back up and get my little markers. So this is an aerial image of one of our sulfur fertilizer trials actually in 2020. And these are areas of the field that were experiencing severe drought stress. And that's what I'm highlighting for you here is one of these large areas in the field. that that area of drought stress has absolutely nothing to do with the treatments in that field. It's a very simple trial with only a zero sulfur and a plus sulfur treatment. So they're side-by-side strips going across the field. These large areas of drought stress have nothing to do with those treatments. So at the end of the year, when I'm working with yield data, I will at least consider removing those yield areas from the trial to, as we say, clean up the data set to make it a little more uniform. So when we harvest these trials, again, we're using commercial combines, almost always equipped with GPS-enabled yield monitors. And so certainly proper calibration of these yield monitors is important to make sure that we're getting accurate yield estimates and grain moisture estimates from these plots in the field. Sometimes people will tell me that, oh, they don't think these yield monitors are accurate enough to use for this kind of field research. And let me just assure you that yes, they can be accurate. They can estimate yields accurately and moisture, assuming you calibrate them in the first place. And it's been our experience with proper calibration techniques that we can limit the error rates of estimating grain weights to 1% or less. In this example from one of our trials in South Central Indiana, this was a 50 or 60 acre trial. Once we got done with calibration, the yield monitor had an average error rate of 0.2% and a maximum error of 0.4. I dare say that I can barely get to that level of accuracy in anything I do in small plot work. So yes, grain yields can be estimated accurately with yield monitors, and that's part of the beauty of making this on-farm research work is with the precision ag technologies that we have. So let me show you some of the workflow I follow on processing yield data. And again, these are the tools and the skill sets that I bring as a researcher to the table on conducting these on-farm collaborative trials. And so I happen to use AgLeader SMS software. I'm not saying it's the best software in the world, but I like it because I can read yield data from a wide range of yield monitors. So yes, AgLeader yield monitors, but also GreenStar, also Case Pro. Essentially any yield monitor on the market, I can read the yield data files. And that's the reason I use this software, because I do work with a wide range of yield monitors in all of these trials. So I first import the yield data into SMS. I do the initial processing of the yield data, making sure the GPS offset is correct, making sure the grain flow time lag is correct, that helps you adjust and make sure these spatial areas like you see here, to make sure that they look good, or I shouldn't say it that way, that they line up the way they're supposed to in the real field. The second step is I use a GIS program called QGIS. The beauty of this program is that it's free. It's a so-called open source GIS program. A little tough to learn, but once you do, it allows you to do the later cleaning steps where sometimes I'll remove areas of the field that are unfairly influencing one treatment over another. I'll use it to intersect yield data with my soil maps, with my elevation maps, with any other spatial data that I want to merge that yield data with. And eventually then I'll export that into a file format that I can bring into Microsoft Excel. And that's what I use to actually summarize the cleaned yield data set and get it down to the plot averages that I use for the whole plot analysis. Now, if we're doing spatial analysis, where we're trying to do more of the site-specific stuff, that might require a little different flow in here. But for doing the straightforward analysis, I bring them into Excel. And then I export it from Excel and take it through a statistical package called SAS. It's one that Purdue has a site license for, so I don't pay anything to use it. Very powerful program, and one that most people out in the off campus or out in the state would not have. But that's what I use to analyze the trial data. So I'll leave you with this bottom line, that field scale research is clearly doable. It can be logistically simple for the growers. It can be statistically effective on the results that we get from it. And it can really help us develop guidelines that are reliable, that are credible, and help us do a much better job at this whole field research arena than we've ever been able to do before. And then along with it, it is simply rewarding to be able to do this kind of collaborative research with growers and their consultants around the state. So thank you for watching this presentation. It's not as good as being there live, and I can appreciate that. If you have questions, my email's in the lower part of the screen here, so don't hesitate to send me an email. I'll be glad to visit with you. Good luck this coming year, and I look forward to seeing you live at another time.